All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Hi, I'm Charlotte, a 36-year-old fitness instructor from Florida. Sharing this is hard, but I need to process how my husband Mark's online flirtation with a woman from his gaming community shattered our 12-year marriage. It began when the Wi-Fi went out. It was a Tuesday. One of those thick, humid Florida afternoons where the air feels like a warm, wet blanket the moment you step outside. I'd just finished my last virtual Pilates class of the day, my muscles pleasantly aching, the familiar scent of clean sweat and disinfectant hanging in the air of our home gym, what was once the second living room. Mark was still at work, or so I thought. Our daughter Lily was at a friend's house for a playdate. The house was quiet in that way it rarely was, a silence so profound it felt like its own presence. I was scrolling through my phone, mindlessly looking at memes and workout videos, when the screen froze. Then, the little Wi-Fi symbol in the corner vanished. I sighed. Not again. Our router was ancient, a relic from a bygone era of technology that seemed to take personal offense at the mere concept of a stable connection. It was Mark's domain, the technology. He was the one who would sigh dramatically, jiggle the right chords, and perform his techno-sorcery until the green lights flickered back to life. I was useless at it. But he wasn't home. The silence was starting to feel less peaceful and more isolating. I had emails to answer, class schedules to confirm. I needed the internet. I trudged upstairs to his office, a small, neat room that always smelled faintly of old paper and the peculiar, metallic scent of his gaming PC. The router sat on a shelf behind his desk, a nest of blinking lights and tangled cables. I reached behind the large monitor to unplug it, my fingers fumbling for the power cord. My elbow brushed the mouse. The monitor, which I'd assumed was asleep, glowed to life with a soft hum. I didn't mean to look. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was just there, a Discord window, open and vibrant against the dark desktop background, a picture of us from a vacation in Colorado years ago, both of us squinting in the sunlight, looking impossibly young. My eyes scanned the text on the screen automatically, my brain parsing the words before my conscience could catch up and tell me to look away. It wasn't a work chat. The username at the top was something whimsical, nonsensical, Serafina, 92s. The profile picture was an anime-style drawing of a woman with violet hair. Mark's username, Nighthawk07, was familiar. He'd used it for years. The last message, time-stamped just 20 minutes ago, was from him. Nighthawks07, I wish I could have heard your laugh for real. It must be a beautiful sound. The world didn't stop. The floor didn't drop out from under me. It was subtler than that and far more terrifying. It was a slow, cold seep, like ice water filling me from the inside out, starting in the pit of my stomach and spreading outwards until my fingertips went numb. My own breath sounded deafening in the quiet room. I wish I could have heard your laugh for real. I read it again and again. The words didn't change. They just sat there on the screen, pristine and digital, a monument to a betrayal I couldn't yet comprehend. My hand, moving of its own volition, scrolled up. The chat wasn't endless, but it was deep. Days and weeks of messages, conversations about the game, some raid boss, strategies, gear. But woven through the game talk were threads of something else. Something intimate. They shared details of their days. His frustrations with a project at his job, her talk of her boring remote data entry job and her cat. They shared music links. They talked about their favorite pizza toppings. He told her about the stress of parenting a preteen my child, framing it as a burden he was bearing alone. He'd complained to her about me, about how I was always on as a fitness instructor, how our home felt more like a gym sometimes, how he missed the quiet, lazy Sundays we used to have before life got so busy. He'd shared a piece of our life, a private, slightly fraying edge of it with this stranger, this Serafina, and then there were the compliments. They were never overtly sexual. They were emotional, the kind of compliments that build a foundation. You always know exactly what to say to calm me down. You're so much more understanding than anyone I know, Earl. Talking to you is the highlight of my day, and now I wish I could have heard your laugh for real. 12 years. 12 years of building a life with someone. You think you know the sound of their soul. You think you can map the topography of their heart from memory. You know which side of the bed they prefer, how they take their coffee, the specific sigh they make when they're truly exhausted versus just mildly annoyed. You've seen them through job losses and family funerals and the birth of your child. You've held them when they were sick. You've celebrated promotions in cheap restaurants and anniversaries with expensive wine. You have 1,000 inside jokes, a shorthand language built from years of shared experience. You think that history is a fortress. But it's not. It's a house of cards. And it can be blown over by a few pixels on a screen, by a sentence meant for another woman's ears. I wish I could have heard your laugh for real. I stood there, frozen, my hand still on the cold plastic of the mouse. The humid Florida air pressed against the windows. Downstairs, the house was still silent, but the silence had transformed. It was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. It was the silence of a life that had just been fundamentally, irrevocably broken. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at those words, feeling the ice in my veins, wondering how the hell I was supposed to plug the router back in and pretend that everything was still connected. The discovery didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a single, clean break. It was a hairline fracture, so fine I almost missed it. A glitch in the reality I thought we were building together. It happened a week after the router incident, a week I'd spent moving through our home like a ghost, the cold seep of betrayal now a constant, low hum in my veins. I was watching him, now. Every smile that seemed a little too quick, every time his phone buzzed and he glanced at it with a faint, almost imperceptible tension in his jaw. I was hyper-aware, a detective in my own life, searching for clues to confirm the nightmare I'd stumbled upon. The opportunity came on Saturday. Our neighbors, the Millers, were having their annual summer BBQ. In the past, I'd loved these events. The smell of charcoal and grilled meat, the sound of kids shrieking as they ran through the sprinkler, the easy, familiar chatter of a suburban Saturday. It was a tableau of normalcy, of the life we were supposed to have. This year, it felt like walking onto a stage set. I had to play my part. Mark was already outside, manning the grill with Tom Miller, a cold beer in his hand. He laughed at something Tom said, and the sound, so normal, so easy, felt like a physical blow. How could he laugh? How could he stand there flipping burgers, when our marriage was lying in ruins just beneath the surface of this perfect day? I busied myself setting out the pasta salad I brought, forcing smiles and making small talk with Sarah Miller about her hydrangeas. The moment came out of nowhere. The Miller's golden retriever, a dopey, lovable beast named Buddy, came loping across the lawn, his tail wagging, covered in grass clippings and drool. He nudged my hand, looking for scraps. I absently scratched behind his ears. "Hey boy," I murmured. "You're a mess, aren't you?" Mark turned from the grill, a smile still on his face from his conversation with Tom. He looked at the dog, then at me. And he said it. The words were casual, offhand, meant to be a part of the easy day banter. "Yeah, he's a good old boy. Isn't that right, Max?" He called him Max. The world didn't stop. The kids kept screaming. The grill kept sizzling. But for me, everything narrowed to that one word. Max. It hung in the humid air between us. Buddy, not Max. Everyone knew the dog's name was Buddy. Tom had given a speech about it when they got him as a puppy, about how he was going to be their little buddies for life. We'd been there. Mark didn't even flinch. He didn't realize he'd said it. He just turned back to the grill and poked at a burger. But I saw it. I saw the tiny, almost invisible thread connecting this moment to the one in his office. It wasn't about the dog's name. It was about a distraction. A mind preoccupied with another conversation, with another person, in another world. His mind was with her. Serafina. Was Max a name from their game? A character? Her pet? A private joke? It didn't matter. What mattered was that a part of him was so deeply engaged elsewhere that the solid, real world around him, his friends, his wife, the very name of the dog he'd seen 100 times, had become fuzzy, unimportant. I felt the ice in my veins solidify. My smile felt plastered on, a rigid, painful thing. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding strange and high-pitched to my own ears. "Good old Buddy," Sarah chuckled. "He'll answer to anything if you have a hot dog in your hand. No one else noticed. The glitch was for me alone. A secret message encoded in a single, wrong syllable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a surreal haze. Every laugh of Mark's felt like a performance. Every time he put his arm around my waist, his touch felt like a brand, a claim he was staking on a life he was simultaneously betraying. I watched him interact with everyone, this man I'd loved for 12 years, and I saw a stranger. I saw the careful facade of a man leading a double life, and I saw the tiny, almost imperceptible cracks where his attention was slipping, bleeding away from this reality and into a digital one. He checked his phone once, not overtly, but a quick, surreptitious glance under the guise of checking the time. His thumb swiped across the screen, a fleeting movement, and the faintest smile, a different smile than the one he gave the neighbors, touched his lips before it was gone. It was the smile from the Discord messages? The private smile, the one meant for her. I thought I was going to be sick. The smell of grilled meat, once so appealing, now felt oppressive and heavy. The shrieks of the children grated on my nerves. This whole picture, the perfect house, the green lawn, the happy couples, it was a lie. My marriage was a lie. The man standing next to me, joking with our friends, was a carefully constructed hologram, and I was the only one who could see the static flickering around the edges. I made an excuse about a headache, which wasn't entirely a lie, and said we needed to head home early. Mark looked surprised, slightly annoyed even, but he covered it quickly with a mask of concern. "Of course, honey, you've been working too hard." He said it loud enough for the others to hear, playing the part of the doting husband perfectly. He made our apologies, and we gathered our things. The ride home was silent. The air in the car was thick with everything that was unsaid. I stared out the window at the passing streets of our Florida neighborhood, the perfectly manicured lawns and pastel-colored houses looking like a film set for a life I no longer recognized. The fracture was no longer hairline. It was a chasm, and I was falling into it. He had called the dog by the wrong name, and in doing so, he had given a name to my pain. It was real, it was happening, and it was so much worse than I could have imagined. The digital words on a screen were one thing, but this casual detachment from our shared reality was a betrayal that breathed and bled right here in the bright, unforgiving Florida sun. The fallout wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no thrown plates, no grand confrontations under the stormy Florida sky. Those things require energy, a fire of passion that had been utterly extinguished inside me, replaced by that pervasive, silent cold. Instead, the betrayal metastasized into something quieter, stranger, a deep, bizarre grief that didn't follow any known stages. It was its own unique, terrible algorithm. I didn't cry. I wanted to. I felt the pressure behind my eyes, a constant aching swell of unshed tears, but they wouldn't fall. It was as if the ice in my veins had frozen them solid. Mark moved through the house, a ghost in his own right, sensing the shift but attributing it to my claimed headache, then to work stress, then to some inexplicable female mood he knew better than to ask about. His ignorance was a form of torture. His normalcy was grotesque. The first bizarre stage of my grief manifested at 2017 a.m. on a Tuesday night. I was in the kitchen, standing in the dark, illuminated only by the pale blue light of the open refrigerator. I wasn't hungry. The idea of food was repulsive. My body, my instrument, my livelihood felt like a foreign, heavy suit I was trapped inside. The fridge hummed its steady, monotonous tune. I stared at the contents without seeing them. Leftovers Mark had boxed up, condiments, a carton of milk. My eyes landed on a tub of ice cream Rocky Road, Lily's favorite. Without a single conscious thought, I reached for it. I didn't get a bowl. I didn't get a spoon. I just took the entire tub and the largest serving spoon I could find, the one we used for holiday casseroles, and I walked to the living room. I sat on the floor, my back against the sofa, in the absolute darkness, and I began to eat. I didn't taste it. I ate mechanically, shoveling the frozen, sugary concrete into my mouth until my teeth ached with the cold. This wasn't comfort eating. This was an act of pure, unadulterated rebellion. A rebellion against the carefully curated nutrition plans I wrote for my clients. A rebellion against the discipline of my own body. A rebellion against the very concept of order. My husband was having an emotional affair with a cartoon avatar, so why shouldn't I eat ice cream for dinner or for breakfast, since that's what time it was? directly from the tub with a casserole spoon on the floor. The absurdity of the action was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that matched the seismic absurdity of my shattered life. I must have fallen asleep there, on the floor, the empty ice cream tub beside me. I woke at dawn to the sound of Mark's alarm upstairs. A sliver of gray light cut through the blinds. I felt a vague stickiness on my cheek, and the first, truly horrific sugar crash of my life. I scrambled to clean the evidence before he came down, my heart pounding with a furtive, shameful energy. I hid the empty tub at the very bottom of the recycling bin, burying it under newspapers and cardboard. The next night, it was the toaster. I was making a piece of toast for Lily, something simple and normal, a performative act of motherhood. The toaster was an old-fashioned one, with shiny chrome sides. As I waited for the bread to pop up, I saw my own reflection in it, distorted, stretched, a funhouse mirror version of myself. My eyes were shadowed, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. And I started talking to it, to her, to the distorted woman in the toaster. "What are you going to do?" I whispered, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. The distorted mouth seemed to move. "What can you do? You have to leave him." The words were out before I could stop them, a truth so bald and terrifying it sucked the air from the room. The reflection wobbled. "And go where? Do what?" "You have a child. A life." "This is your life. This is a lie," I breathed, my fingers gripping the cold edge of the countertop. "It's the only life you have," the toaster woman shot back. "He's sorry. He doesn't even know he's done it. It didn't mean anything. It was just a game." The bread popped up, startling me. The moment broke. I was just a tired woman holding a piece of hot bread, standing alone in her kitchen. But the conversations with my reflection, in the toaster, in the microwave door, in the dark window glass at night, became a ritual. It was the only way I could argue with myself, could vocalize the tornado of thoughts without actually giving voice to them and making them real for anyone else. I was having intense, silent negotiations with appliances. My grief had made me feral, nonsensical. I started burning things. Not important things. Not his things. That would have been too direct, too acknowledging. I gathered up old relics. A ticket stub from a movie we'd seen on our third date. A faded receipt from a dinner that had once felt magical. A birthday card he'd signed with, "All my love forever." I didn't make a ceremony of it. I took them out to the grill, the same one he'd cooked burgers on during that fateful BBQ. I doused the charcoal in lighter fluid, lit a match, and dropped the little pile of memories onto the flames. I watched the edges of the paper curl and blacken, the words "forever" vanishing into smoke. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of erasure. I was systematically, quietly, burning the evidence of the love I thought we had. If the proof was gone, then maybe the pain of its loss would somehow lessen. The physical act of watching it turn to ash was morbidly satisfying. It felt like progress. This was my life now: clandestine ice cream binges, arguments with kitchen appliances, and arson of my own past in the backyard grill. This was the ice cream for dinner phase, and I was its lonely, bizarre queen. The bizarre grief phase had a shelf life. You can only eat so much ice cream in the dark before the sugar high becomes a metaphor for your entire crashing existence. You can only have so many conversations with a toaster before you start to question your own sanity more than your husband's choices. The turning point wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration. It was a slow, grinding realization, like a glacier finally deciding to move. It arrived not with a bang, but with the soft, pathetic thud of an empty ice cream tub hitting the bottom of the recycling bin for the third time that week. I looked at it there, nestled among the egg cartons and cereal boxes, a monument to my despair. And I was just bored of it, bored of the sadness, bored of the silence, bored of feeling like a ghost in my own home. The cold anger was still there, a solid, frozen core in my chest, but it had shifted. It was no longer directed inward at my own perceived failings. It was now a fuel, and I needed to burn it on something other than self-pity and memorabilia. I didn't decide to find myself or embrace self-love. Those concepts felt too vast, too abstract. My life had been fractured into a million tiny pixels by a digital affair. I needed to rebuild it with something tangible, something my hands could touch. I needed to lean into my weirdest passion, the one I'd always treated as a frivolous hobby, a secret shame. It was pottery, not the elegant, wheel-thrown vases you see in galleries. My passion was for the bizarre, the ugly, the awkward. I loved creating misshapen mugs with lopsided handles. I loved sculpting little clay creatures that were more nightmare than fantasy goblins, with too many eyes, owls with suspiciously human expressions, pots that looked like they'd melted and then frozen again in a state of profound confusion. Mark had always given my creations a polite, bemused smile. "There, interesting, honey," he'd say, before suggesting, "Maybe I take a class on technique." The garage was my domain. I'd set up a cheap pottery wheel and a small kiln years ago, and it had mostly gathered dust. That Wednesday afternoon, after dropping Lily off at school, I didn't go to the gym. I went to the garage. I plugged in the wheel. I grabbed a lump of wet, cool clay from the bag. The smell of earth and water filled my lungs, a primal scent that felt more real than anything had in weeks. I didn't have a plan. I just centered the clay on the wheel, my hands remembering the motions my mind had forgotten. The wheel spun, a steady, rhythmic hum. I pushed my thumbs into the center, opening up the form. The clay yielded, cool and slick under my fingers. My world shrank to the spinning circle of gray earth. There was no Mark, no Serafina, no Discord messages. There was only the pressure of my hands, the resistance of the clay, the sound of the wheel. It was a meditation, an exorcism. I didn't try to make something beautiful. I let the anger guide me. I made a mug that was aggressively asymmetrical. I made a bowl with a jagged, torn rim. I sculpted a small, angry-looking garden gnome that seemed to be scowling at the world. With each creation, I felt a piece of the ice in my chest chip away, melted by the sheer physical act of creation. This wasn't for him. This wasn't for an audience. This was for me. It was ugly, and it was mine. On a whim, I took a picture of my bizarre little menagerie, the lopsided mug, the torn bowl, the scowling gnome, and posted it on a niche online marketplace for handmade goods. I called the shop the Ungrateful Goblin. It was a joke. A placeholder. I didn't expect anything to happen. The next morning, my phone chimed. It was a notification from the marketplace. Someone had bought the scowling gnome. A woman from Oregon had messaged me. "This gnome perfectly encapsulates my feeling about Mondays. Thank you for making this." I stared at the message, a real, genuine laugh bubbling up in my throat for the first time in what felt like centuries. It was a short, surprised sound that startled me. Someone out there understood my weird, angry art. Someone wanted it in their home. That sale was a tiny, flickering flame. I made more. I sculpted a anxiety bug with too many legs and worried eyes. I made a passive-aggressive planter with a sweet floral pattern on one side and a grotesque, screaming face hidden on the other. I threw a vase that was deliberately off-center, listing to the side as if exhausted by life itself. And they sold. One by one, my bizarre, ugly little creations found homes. My kitchen, once a place of silent grief and conversations with appliances, became a drying rack for clay. My garage smelled of creativity and effort, not dust and neglect. I wasn't just working, I was building a fortress. A small, strange, lopsided fortress made of clay, but it was mine. Every notification of a sale was a brick in the wall. Every positive review was a mortar that held it together. Mark noticed the change, of course. He'd come into the garage, his face a mixture of confusion and relief. "You're spending a lot of time out here," he'd say, watching me coat a particularly hideous mug in a garish green glaze. "It's keeping me busy," I'd reply, my voice neutral, my focus on the brush in my hand. I wasn't hiding my pain anymore. I was channeling it. I was turning his betrayal, my grief, my confusion, into something solid, into something I could sell for $24. Plus shipping. It was the most satisfying "fuck you" I could have ever devised, and he was utterly oblivious to it. The rally wasn't a declaration of war. It was a quiet, determined secession. I was building my own kingdom, one ugly pot at a time. The universe doesn't send a billboard when it decides to throw you a lifeline. It doesn't orchestrate a grand, romantic meeting in a Parisian cafe or on a wind-swept beach. At least, it didn't for me. My lifeline arrived in a metal box during the blackout, and it smelled faintly of ozone and panic. It was the day of the big storm. Florida summers are a parade of them, but this one was different. The sky had turned a sickly, bruised green, and the air was so still and heavy, it felt like the world was holding its breath. I'd been at the library, a place I'd started going to for the silence and the reliable Wi-Fi somewhere Mark wouldn't think to look for me. I was researching glazing techniques for my new anxiety bug series, my laptop plugged into an outlet near the biography section. The first sign was the lights. They flickered once, twice, and then died with a soft, final sigh. A collective groan went up from the handful of patrons. The emergency lights kicked in, casting a dim, yellowish glow that made the vast room look cavernous and eerie. Through the tall windows, the sky was now almost black. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the building. The librarian announced the building was closing early and that everyone should try to get home safely. I made a dash for it, sprinting through the parking lot as the first fat, cold raindrops began to fall. My car was on the other side of the plaza. I was aiming for the bank building next door, planning to duck under its overhang, when the sky truly opened. It was a biblical deluge, a solid wall of water that soaked me to the skin in 3 seconds flat. I yelped and veered towards the nearest door, a set of sleek glass doors leading to a modern office building I'd never paid much attention to. I stumbled into the lobby, dripping a large puddle onto the polished marble floor. The place was deserted, a ghost town of empty reception desks and silent monitors. The power was out here too, the only light coming from the storm-darkened windows. And then, I heard it. A low, mechanical whir followed by a definitive, sickening thump. I turned. Across the lobby, the doors of a single elevator were closed, but the digital display above it was dark. A voice, muffled but clear, came from behind the doors. "Well, this is suboptimal." I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty lobby. "Hello to you too," the voice replied, remarkably calm. "I take it the apocalypse is proceeding on schedule out there?" "It's just a storm," I said, walking closer to the elevator doors. "Are you stuck?" "The evidence would suggest that, yes," the voice said. I could hear a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on metal. Between floors, I think. The lights went out, we did a little jig, and now here we are. Hello, by the way. "And you are, my mysterious lobby savior?" I almost smiled. The absurdity of making introductions with a trapped stranger through a metal door was exactly the kind of weird my life had become. "Charlotte," I said, "I'm not sure I'm much of a savior. The power's out everywhere. I just got caught in the rain." "A fellow refugee," Leo said. "Excellent. So, what's the play? Should we try to solve a murder?" I feel like this is how every Agatha Christie novel starts. We're all trapped together and then, gasp, someone turns up dead. I let out a real laugh this time, a short, surprised burst of sound. I think it's just the two of us. And I promise I'm not armed. A shame. I was hoping for a little drama. "So, Charlotte, what brings you to this particular corner of purgatory on this fine, stormy afternoon?" What could I say? I'm hiding from my husband's emotional affair by making ugly pottery in my garage. Instead, I went with a sliver of the truth. I was at the library. Research. A scholar. Let me guess. Theoretical physics? 1.2 minuses. The complete works of Dickens? The history of competitive spoon collecting? Pottery glazes, actually. There was a beat of silence from the elevator. Okay, I did not see that coming. You have officially elevated this from a mundane inconvenience to a fascinating interlude. Tell me about pottery glazes. And so? I did. Standing there in a dark lobby, my clothes dripping onto the floor, I talked to a trapped man about the chemical magic of cobalt oxide and the frustrating unpredictability of copper carbonate. I told him about my ugly goblins. I told him about the ungrateful goblin shop. And he listened. He asked intelligent questions. He didn't once say it was interesting, in that dismissive way Mark had. He told me about his job as a technical writer, which he described as translating engineer speak into something resembling English for people who would rather be doing anything else. He made it sound hilarious and slightly noble. He told me about his dog, a rescue mutt named Fitzwilliam who is afraid of his own shadow and leaves the room if you sneeze too loudly. We talked about everything and nothing. The storm raged outside, battering the windows. But inside, in that dim, quiet space, it felt like a cocoon. There was no pressure, no history, no betrayal. It was just two people, trapped in their own ways, keeping each other company through a door. It was the easiest, most natural conversation I'd had in years. He was witty and self-deprecating and genuinely curious. He didn't feel the need to perform or impress. He was just, Leo, stuck in an elevator. After what felt like both 5 minutes and 5 hours, the emergency lights in the lobby flickered and grew brighter. A hum returned to the building. The elevator display above Leo's prison lit up with a cheerful bing. "Well, would you look at that?" Leo's voice said, filled with mock disappointment. "It appears our adventure is at an end." The doors slid open with a smooth, quiet whisper. And there he was. He wasn't movie star handsome. He was pleasant, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a slightly crooked smile, hair that was a little messy from his ordeal. He was holding a leather satchel and looked completely unruffled. "Charlotte, I presume," he said, stepping out. "It's a pleasure to finally see the face that goes with the voice of pottery expertise." "Leo," I said, suddenly feeling shy. "You survived." Thanks to the excellent distraction, he looked out the window. The rain was still coming down, but it had lessened to a steady pour. "Can I offer you a lift?" "My car's in the garage. It seems the least I can do for my lobby savior." I should have said no. I should have made an excuse. But the thought of going back to my silent, tense house, to the smell of clay and unresolved pain, was unbearable. "I'd like that," I heard myself say. He smiled, a real, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Great. And on the way you can tell me more about this anxiety bug. It sounds like a creature after my own heart." As we walked towards the parking garage, the world outside was still wet and chaotic, but for the first time in a long time, the storm inside me had quieted. My lifeline hadn't been a knight on a white horse. It was a technical writer with a good sense of humor, stuck in an elevator. And it was the most plot-twisty thing that had ever happened to me. A lift home in the rain should have been awkward. A stranger, a confined space, the forced intimacy of a car interior while the world outside washes away. But with Leo, it wasn't. It was easy. The ease of it was the first green flag, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I was too busy trying to remember the last time I'd laughed so freely, without the bitter aftertaste of performance or the hollow echo of pretending everything was fine. He drove a sensible, slightly older sedan that smelled faintly of coffee and dog. There was a well-chewed rubber bone in the cup holder and a stack of CDs in the console. No fancy Bluetooth, just actual physical albums. It was so unpretentious, so genuinely him, that it immediately put me at ease. He didn't apologize for the mess. He just grinned, scooped the bone and a stray leash out of the passenger seat, and tossed them into the back. "Fitzwilliam's mobile throne," he said by way of explanation. "Make yourself at home." The second green flag was his curiosity. It wasn't an interrogation. He didn't ask me about my husband or what brought me to Florida or any of the standard getting-to-know-you questions that felt like landmines. He asked about the clay. He wanted to know what made a glaze food-safe versus just decorative. He asked if the anxiety bug had a name, and when I said no, he spent a good 5 minutes suggesting increasingly ridiculous ones, from Sir Fretz-a-Lot to the Duke of Dread. I was crying with laughter by the time we pulled up to my house. The house. My stomach tightened as it came into view. It looked like a model home from the outside. Perfectly manicured lawn, cheerful yellow paint, the porch swing Mark had insisted on but never used. It was a beautiful set for a life that was no longer playing. Leo put the car in park but left the engine running. He looked at the house, then at me, and his smile softened into something more thoughtful. "Nice place," he said. It wasn't a loaded comment. It was just an observation. "Thanks," I said, my hand on the door handle, suddenly reluctant to leave the warm, easy bubble of his car for the cold silence waiting for me inside. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle. "I had a really good time talking to you. Even if the circumstances were electrically deficient." He paused and a faint blush crept up his neck. "Look, I know this is probably weird and feel free to say no. But there's this terrible, wonderful, incredibly cheesy 80s movie marathon at the old Sunrise Cinema downtown this weekend. The Goonies, Back to the Future, Breakfast Club, the whole lineup. I go every year. It's my guilty pleasure. I was wondering if you'd want to go. No pressure. 0. Honestly, it's probably a terrible idea, and that's when he gave me the third and brightest green flag. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. He wasn't trying to be cool or impress me with some fancy dinner plan. He was offering me a piece of his genuine dorky self, his love for cheesy 80s movies. And he was doing it while openly acknowledging it might be a weird ask, his ears turning pink with the admission. He owned it. He could have tried to play it smooth, but he didn't. He was nervous, and it was the most endearing thing I'd seen in a decade. I thought of Mark, who curated his interests based on what he thought made him look sophisticated. Mark, who would never be caught dead admitting to a guilty pleasure, let alone inviting a woman to share in it. Mark, whose every interaction felt calculated for effect. The Goonies is not a terrible movie, I said, feigning offense. It's a cinematic masterpiece. Leo's face lit up. You know about the truffle shuffle? It's a core childhood memory. Okay, he said, holding up his hands in surrender, a wide grin spreading across his face. I apologize. I have misjudged you. You are clearly a woman of taste and discernment. I laughed. The marathon sounds amazing. I'd love to go. Really? He looked genuinely surprised and thrilled, like he'd just won a prize. Great, that's great. Saturday? I'll pick you up? We can get giant, ridiculously overpriced popcorn and everything. It's a date, I said, and the word hung in the air between us, charged and new and not entirely terrifying. I got out of the car and watched him drive away, a sense of lightness in my chest that felt foreign and exhilarating. I walked into the house, and the silence was there, as expected. But it felt different. It felt like it was waiting for me to fill it, rather than suffocate me. Mark was in the living room, watching a sports highlight reel. He muted the TV when I walked in. You're late. I was getting worried. The storm was pretty bad. His concern sounded like a line from a script. I got stuck, I said, which was true. Took shelter in an office building. Someone gave me a lift home. Also true. I left out the elevator part. I left out Leo. The truths felt like tiny treasures, things that belonged only to me. Oh, good. He unmuted the TV. The moment of manufactured concern was over. The highlight reel blared back to life. I went upstairs, changed out of my damp clothes, and stood in front of my bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had color in her cheeks. Their eyes were brighter. She looked alive. I didn't have a conversation with her. I just smiled. For the first time in a long time, the smile in the reflection was real. It wasn't about revenge or moving on or any grand plan. It was about a cute, dorky guy with a dog named Fitzwilliam who liked bad movies and wasn't afraid to show it. It was a green flag, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was finally willing to see it. Our date wasn't a date in the conventional sense. There was no nervous preening, no second-guessing my outfit, no agonizing over what every little text might mean. It felt inevitable, like resuming a conversation that had only been paused. When Leo picked me up on Saturday, he wasn't holding flowers. He was holding 2 reusable cups of ridiculously overpriced artisan coffee. Fuel for the cinematic endurance test ahead, he'd said by way of greeting, handing me one. The gesture was so thoughtful and so perfectly us already that my nerves settled instantly. The Sunrise Cinema was a relic, all faded velvet and sticky floors, and it smelled of popcorn and nostalgia. We found 2 seats in the middle of the packed theater, and as the lights dimmed for the Goonies, Leo leaned over and whispered, "Truffle, shuffle, or bust," and I knew I was in trouble. The good kind of trouble. The kind that feels like coming home. We didn't try to hold hands. We didn't need to. We were too busy laughing at the same dumb jokes, quoting lines under our breath in unison, and groaning at the dated special effects. During a quiet moment, he offered me a piece of his popcorn, his fingers brushing mine in the bucket, and a simple electric jolt went up my arm. It wasn't a grand, passionate spark. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a connection that was steadily, naturally wiring itself together. After the marathon, bleary-eyed and hoarse from laughing, we stumbled out into the balmy Florida night. We were too keyed up to go home, so we ended up at a 24-hour diner that had vinyl booths and a jukebox that played songs from a century we were currently marinating in. Over greasy fries and chocolate milkshakes, we dissected the movies, argued over the best John Hughes film, and then, somehow, the conversation drifted. He told me about his sister who lived across the country and how they'd bonded over these same movies as kids when their parents were fighting. It was a vulnerable, quiet confession offered without any expectation of reciprocation. I found myself telling him about Lily, about the terrifying, wonderful weight of motherhood, about the fear that I was failing her by staying in a marriage that had become a ghost town. I didn't say the word affair, but I didn't have to. He listened, his eyes never leaving my face, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of my confession. "You're not failing her," he said softly, stirring his milkshake. "You're showing her how to survive. And eventually, how to build something new. Even if it's lopsided and weird." He smiled, a reference to my pottery. "Especially if it's lopsided and weird. That's where the good stuff is." That became our new normal. Not dramatic declarations, but a steady accumulation of small, perfect moments built on a foundation that was uniquely us. Our perfect weekend wasn't fancy dinners or glamorous parties. It was exploring flea markets for vintage board games with missing pieces. We'd spend hours inventing new rules to compensate, laughing until our sides hurt. One Sunday, we attempted to bake an elaborate Black Forest cake from scratch. It was an unmitigated disaster. Flour dusted every surface of my kitchen, we burned 2 layers, and the whipped cream frosting turned into a soupy mess. We ended up eating the salvageable parts directly from the pans with our fingers, covered in chocolate and cherry filling, and it was infinitely better than any perfect store-bought cake could have ever been. Another weekend, we built an elaborate blanket fort in my living room, stringing up fairy lights and dragging every pillow and cushion we could find into a giant nest. We argued passionately over what to stream, a documentary about deep-sea fish versus a reality show about competitive baking, and finally settled on an old mystery series we could both mock relentlessly. Lying there in the dim, cozy light, our shoulders touching, the rest of the world, Mark in his office, the silent tension of the house, the digital ghost of Serafina felt a million miles away. This was our happiness. It was built on failed cakes and flea market finds and blanket forts. It was messy and imperfect, and ours. He met Lily eventually, not as a grand introduction, but organically. He came over one afternoon when she was home, and instead of trying to impress her, he asked if she wanted to help him build a particularly complicated Lego set he'd found at a thrift store. I watched them from the kitchen, my heart in my throat, as they sat on the floor, heads bent over the instructions, talking in low, serious tones. He didn't talk down to her. He treated her like a small, intelligent colleague. And Lily, who had been so withdrawn and quiet, slowly opened up to him. This was the new normal. It wasn't about erasing the past 12 years. It was about building a new present, brick by quirky brick. It was choosing this gentle, funny man who cried at sappy commercials and owned it, who loved my weird art, and who saw the woman I was underneath the layers of grief and wifeness and motherhood. The upgrade wasn't a better man, it was a truer life. And it was a million times more fun. The blanket forts and flea markets, the shared laughs and the quiet understanding, they built a new world for me, a sanctuary. But sanctuaries have walls, and outside those walls, the old world was still there, waiting. It was a life of quiet glances and unspoken questions, of Mark existing in one room while I lived in another, our paths crossing like polite strangers sharing a hotel corridor. The confrontation wasn't a dramatic showdown. It was a quiet, final realization that settled over me one ordinary Tuesday evening. It was Lily who catalyzed it. She was working on a school project, a family tree. She had her construction paper and markers spread out across the kitchen table, her little brow furrowed in concentration. Mark was in his office, presumably working or gaming or talking to her. I was putting away groceries. The silence between our activities, a physical thing. "Mom?" Lily asked, not looking up from her drawing. "What's Grandma's maiden name again? And, is it okay if I put Leo on here?" My hand froze, a can of soup halfway to the cupboard. The question was so innocent, so practical. Where did Leo fit? In her world, he did. In mine, he absolutely did. But on the official record? On the family tree? I looked at the diagram she was drawing. There was a branch for her, for me, for Mark. There were branches for grandparents. It was a map of blood and law. And she wanted to add Leo, a man who had entered our lives through a stuck elevator and cheesy movies, because he felt like family. Before I could answer, Mark walked into the kitchen to get a drink. He heard her question. He stopped, his hand on the refrigerator door, and looked at her drawing. His face, usually a mask of pleasant detachment, tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't look at me. "Why would you put Leo on there, kiddo?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "He's not family." The words weren't said with malice. They were just a statement of fact, from his perspective. But they landed on me with the weight of a final judgment. He's not family. In that moment, I saw the two paths with terrifying clarity. One path was this: a life of correcting, of justifying, of trying to fit the beautiful, lopsided, joyful reality of my connection with Leo into the rigid, empty structure of a marriage that had become a legal fiction. It was a life of having my happiness constantly questioned, of forcing Lily to compartmentalize her affections, of forever making Leo an asterisk, a footnote on a family tree where he had become the trunk. The other path was terrifying. It was upheaval. It was lawyers and explanations and dividing assets. It was telling my daughter that the family she knew was changing shape. It was fear and uncertainty, but it was also truth. I looked at Mark, really looked at him. He was already retreating back into his own world, taking his water bottle, his moment of paternal intervention over. He hadn't asked why Leo was so important to Lily. He hadn't asked why he was so important to me. He simply asserted the old boundary and walked away, back to his office, back to his screen. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore, it was ontological. We were living in two different realities, and he preferred his. I walked over to Lily and knelt beside her chair. "Grandma's maiden name was Miller," I said softly, my voice steady. "And we can put anyone on there who feels like family to you. Love makes family too. It's a different kind of tree," she smiled, satisfied, and wrote, "Leo" on a little leaf off to the side, connecting it to her branch with a dotted line. It was her solution, and it was perfect. That night, after Lily was asleep, I didn't go to the garage. I didn't talk to the toaster. I went into the living room where Mark was watching TV. I sat down in the chair opposite him, not on the couch next to him. The distance between the two pieces of furniture felt like a canyon. "We need to talk," I said. My voice didn't shake. He muted the TV. The silence was immediate and heavy. He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I think he actually saw me. Not the wife, not the fitness instructor, not the ghost in his house, but me, Charlotte, a woman who had reached her limit. "I can't do this anymore," I said. There were no accusations. No listing of his faults. No mention of Serafina. That wasn't the point anymore. The point was the life, or the lack of it, that was happening right here, in this room. This isn't a marriage. We're roommates, we're co-parents, and that's not enough for me. I deserve more, and you deserve to be happy too. But we're not making each other happy. We're just occupying space." He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He nodded slowly, staring at the blank, silent screen. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. Just 2 words. No fight. No denial. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a truth we had both been living for months. The conversation that followed was practical, almost shockingly so. It was about logistics, about Lily, about the house. It was sad, yes. There was a grief there for the life we had planned, for the years we had invested. But underneath the sadness was a profound sense of relief. The pretense was over. The performance was finished. We were finally, after all this time, being honest. I wasn't choosing Leo over Mark. That was the biggest realization of all. I was choosing myself. I was choosing a life where I didn't have to eat ice cream on the floor in the dark. I was choosing a reality where my daughter could put the people who loved her on her family tree, no matter where they came from. I was choosing a future that wasn't built on the ashes of the past, but on the fresh, wet clay of the present. I was choosing to build my own tree, and for the first time, I knew I could make it strong enough to weather any storm. The weeks that followed the conversation were a strange, liminal space, a purgatory of paperwork and polite coexistence. Mark moved into the guest room. We told Lily together, using careful, age-appropriate language about grown-ups, sometimes changing how they love each other, but always loving their children just the same. She cried. We held her. It was the most unified we had been in years, and it was in the service of dismantling our union. The irony was a sharp, quiet pain. The house, once a symbol of our shared dream, became a neutral territory, a loading dock for two separate futures. We moved through it with a newfound, painful courtesy. I'll be out Thursday evening. Leo and I are taking Lily to the planetarium. Okay, thanks for letting me know. I've got that conference call until 7. Our conversations were logistical, clean, devoid of the emotional static that had plagued us for months. The fighting was over because the war was over. There was nothing left to fight for. I expected to feel a crushing wave of grief, and it did come in moments. I'd be folding laundry and would suddenly catch the scent of his cologne on a shirt, and my knees would go weak with the memory of a happier time. I'd find a note in his handwriting, a grocery list from a lifetime ago, and the finality of it would hit me all over again. But these waves were followed by an unexpected sense of calm. The uncertainty was gone. The pretense was gone. I was standing on solid, if unfamiliar, ground. I threw myself into my work, both of them. My fitness classes became a sanctuary of physical release, a place where I could channel all the chaotic energy into something productive, something that helped others feel strong in their bodies when I was struggling to feel strong in my spirit. And my pottery became my voice. The Anxiety Bug series evolved. I started making pieces that were less about anger and more about metamorphosis. A vase that was cracked and broken on one side, but beautifully glazed and whole on the other. A set of cups whose handles were two hands, one holding the other, in a gesture of self-support. I was no longer just burning the past. I was melting it down and reshaping it into something that acknowledged the break, but celebrated the repair. The ungrateful goblin shop was thriving, a small but mighty testament to the fact that something beautiful could grow from the rubble. Leo was my anchor through it all, but he was careful not to be my life raft. He never badmouthed Mark. He never pushed me to move faster than I was ready. He simply existed in my new reality as a constant, steady presence. His patience was its own language of love. He'd come over after Mark had left for work and we'd drink coffee in my kitchen, and it felt peaceful, not clandestine. He helped me turn the dreaded guest room, now just a spare room, into a proper studio, building sturdy shelves for my kiln and my ever-growing army of misfit creations. One Saturday, we took Lily to the beach. It was a brilliant, clear day, the Gulf water a stunning turquoise. Mark had her for the weekend, but he'd agreed to let us take her for the afternoon. It was the first time the three of us had done something so normal. So public. Lily ran into the waves, shrieking with laughter, and Leo followed her, pretending to be attacked by sea monsters. I watched them from the shore, my feet buried in the warm sand, and I felt a peace so profound it brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't a perfect picture. It was better. It was real. It was messy and complicated and ours. Later, as we sat on a towel eating sandy sandwiches, Lily looked up at me, her face serious. "I'm sad that you and Daddy don't love each other like that anymore," she said, her little voice matter-of-fact. "I know, sweetie," I said, my heart aching. "Me too, sometimes. But," she said, popping a chip into her mouth, "I like it that my family got bigger. Now I have you and Daddy, and I also have Leo." She said it so simply, as if she were stating that the sky was blue. She had unraveled the old definition of family and woven a new, more expansive one, all on her own. That was the moment I truly understood the upgrade. It wasn't about trading one man for a better one. It was about expanding the universe of love available to us. It was about showing my daughter that while endings are sad and hard, they are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a new chapter, one that can be written with hope, with creativity, and with the courage to build a blanket fort of your own design, even if the pattern is lopsided and weird. The unraveling of one life was simply the necessary prelude to the weaving of another, more colorful, more honest one. And we were all learning to weave together. The paperwork was signed. The new rhythm, however awkward, was established. Mark had found a condo across town and was slowly moving his things out. Each box he carried to his car was like a stone lifted from my chest, the weight lessening incrementally, allowing me to breathe a little deeper each time. The house was beginning to feel less like a museum of our failed marriage and more like a blank canvas, scuffed and worn in places, but full of potential. One evening, after Leo had left and Lily was asleep, I found myself alone in the living room. The silence was different now. It wasn't the oppressive, heavy silence of secrets and sorrow. It was a peaceful, empty silence. The kind that invites you to just be. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't pick up my phone. I just sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, and looked around the room. My eyes landed on a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was from our 5th anniversary. We were on a beach in Mexico, tanned and smiling, our arms around each other, looking like the very picture of marital bliss. I'd kept it there long after the feeling had evaporated, a testament to the life I thought we were supposed to have. I'd dusted it every week, preserving a ghost. I got up and walked over to it. I picked up the frame. The glass was cool against my fingers. I expected a pang of sharp, debilitating grief. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a gentle, almost nostalgic sadness, like remembering a favorite book from childhood whose plot you've mostly forgotten. The people in that picture were strangers. A young woman who believed love was a permanent state, not a choice you had to make every single day. A young man who hadn't yet learned to seek connection in pixels instead of in the person beside him. I didn't hate him. The realization was quiet but absolute. The anger had burned itself out in the kiln of the past months, transformed into something solid and useful. I felt a profound sense of pity for him, for the man who had chosen a fantasy over the messy, beautiful reality right in front of him. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude for myself, for the woman who had finally chosen to stop preserving the ghost and start living her life. I took the photo out of the frame. The paper was slightly faded. I didn't rip it up. I didn't burn it. I simply walked to my office, and filed it away in a folder with other old documents. It was a part of my history, but it was no longer my present. It didn't define me. It was just a chapter. A chapter that was now over. I went back to the living room and picked up one of my own creations from the shelf, a small, lumpy clay heart I'd made during one of my first sessions. It was imperfect, with thumbprints still visible in the surface and a glaze that had pooled a little too much on one side. It was lopsided. It was weird. It was mine. I placed it right in the center of the empty mantelpiece where the perfect anniversary photo had been for so long. It looked small and silly and utterly perfect there. A symbol of a heart that had been broken but had chosen to remake itself, not into what it was before, but into something new, something unique, something stronger in its broken places. My biggest fear had always been being alone. I'd clung to the shell of my marriage because the emptiness of that word terrified me. But as I stood there, looking at that silly clay heart on the mantel, I realized I wasn't alone. I had myself. I had my daughter. I had a man who loved my weird art and made me laugh without trying. I had a life I was building with my own 2 hands, literally and figuratively. The upgrade was never about him. It was about this moment. It was about the quiet, powerful realization that I was enough. That my life, with all its cracks and imperfections, was enough. And that choosing a partner wasn't about needing one to be complete. It was about wanting one to share your already complete, wonderfully weird life with. The fear was gone. In its place was a simple, steady certainty. I was going to be okay. More than okay. I was going to be happy. And it was going to be on my own terms. The climax wasn't about him. That was the most surprising part. There was no final, dramatic confrontation with Mark, no tearful plea for forgiveness, no moment where he realized the error of his ways and begged me to come back. That was a fantasy from an old, discarded script. The real climax was quieter, smaller, and infinitely more powerful. It happened on an utterly ordinary Wednesday evening. Leo was over. We were in the kitchen, attempting to make pizza from scratch. Flour was everywhere. My supposedly foolproof dough was stubbornly refusing to rise, and our attempts to toss it in the air like professional pizzaiolos had resulted in a sad, doughy pancake stuck to the ceiling fan. We were laughing, really laughing, in that helpless, breathless way that makes your stomach ache. Lily was drawing at the kitchen table, rolling her eyes at our incompetence but smiling anyway. The doorbell rang. The sound was so foreign, so unexpected in the midst of our messy joy. that we all fell silent for a second. I wiped my floury hands on a towel and went to answer it. Mark stood on the porch. He held a small box in his hands, the last of his things from the home office. He looked older, tired. He offered a weak smile. "Hey, sorry to just drop by." I was in the neighborhood. "It's okay," I said, and it was. I held the door open wider. "Come in." He stepped inside, and the scene that greeted him must have been like a photograph from an alternate universe. There was flour on the floor. A sad piece of dough was slowly peeling off the ceiling. Leo, with a comical streak of tomato sauce on his cheek, was trying to salvage our cheese situation. Lily looked up from her drawing. "Hi, Daddy, we're making a mess." Mark's eyes took it all in. The mess. The laughter that had just been hanging in the air. The easy, comfortable way Leo stood in his kitchen. The way I stood there, flour in my hair, not apologizing for any of it. I saw it hit him then, not as an idea, but as a physical reality. This was my life now. It was messy and loud and imperfect. And I was radiantly, undeniably happy. He swallowed, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a profound regret flicker in his eyes. Not just for losing me, but for losing this. This simple, unvarnished joy. He had traded it for the quiet, lonely thrill of a digital fantasy, and he knew it. "I just came to drop this off," he said, his voice a little hoarse. He set the box down by the door. I'll let you get back to it. You can stay for pizza," I said. The offer was genuine. There was no malice in it, no desire to rub it in. It was simply an offer from one human to another. It might be terrible, but there will probably be enough. He looked at me, and I saw the ghost of the man I'd married. He looked at Leo, who gave him a friendly, non-threatening nod. He looked at Lily, who was already back to her drawing, utterly unconcerned by the tectonic plates shifting in her parents' lives. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "No, I should go. You guys, you look like you're having fun." He turned and let himself out. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the sound of his car pulling away from the curb. I felt nothing, no triumph, no sadness, just a quiet acknowledgement that a door had just gently closed, and the one behind me was wide open, filled with light and noise and mess. I walked back into the kitchen. Leo was prying the dough off the ceiling with a spatula. "I think we should order Thai," he declared. "I think you're a genius," I laughed. And that was it. That was the climax. The moment he saw, the moment he understood what he had lost, and I understood what I had gained. The upgrade was never about trading one man for another. It was the moment I realized I was no longer afraid of being alone, but I was choosing this man, this life, this mess, every single day, not out of need, but because he made my weird post-heartbreak life a million times more fun. He didn't complete me. He complemented me. And that was so much better. I looked at Leo, covered in flour and sauce, and my heart didn't flutter with dramatic passion. It settled. It felt like home. The upgrade wasn't an event. It was a state of being, and I was finally living in it.